Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Putting the Supplier at the Heart of Procurement, featuring Peter Smith of Spend Matters UK Europe, Jason Busch of Spend Matters, and Richard Waugh of Zycus. My name is Sheena Moore, and I'll be moderating today. Before we get started, I'd just like to run through a few quick housekeeping items. If you're hearing any feedback, please turn the volume down on your computer speakers and microphones. If you have a question for the presenters, type it in the question sections on the lower right side, and we'll get to it during the Q&A session, depending on time. Our most asked question is yes, you will receive a copy of the slides after the event, along with a link to the recording. Besides that, you'll even receive a copy of the companion white paper written by Peter Smith before it's made available to the general public. Also, a survey will pop up as the webinar closes. Please take a minute or two to fill it out to help us improve our programming in the future. With that, I'd like to pass it to Jason Busch to introduce Spend Matters and get things rolling.
Great. Thanks so much, Sheena. Next slide, please. Just some very quick background on Spend Matters. Most of you are probably familiar with it. Super excited today to have Peter Smith leading this webinar. Peter represents us in Europe and in the UK. He's the founder of Spend Matters UK Europe. Experience, as you'll hear in a bit, both in the private and public sectors running procurement organizations, and in my view is one of the best thinkers in procurement globally at this point. And I think some of his philosophy around the future of supplier management is absolutely fascinating, much deeper than we are outside of technology. As folks who know Spend Matters well in the US, he spent quite a bit of time looking at supplier management from a technology standpoint. I'm going to touch on that. But Peter's analysis of where we're headed from a philosophical standpoint around supplier management, I think, is key to pay attention to. Peter is one of 17 team members, which are now part of the broader Spend Matters portfolio of families. We've got multiple sites, including our subscription sites. Next slide, please. Spend Matters Network and Spend Matters Pro provide one place to check in and see what is going on across our breadth of content. The network represents all of our content in one place, spendmatters.net, and Spend Matters Pro is our subscription research. We're super excited to provide an integrated site experience for our Spend Matters and Spend Matters Pro readers, and soon to be Spend Matters UK Europe readers as well, being able to access premium content within the context of our main site. But if you are interested in some of the deeper insights you hear today, you'll want to check out Spend Matters Pro. We offer a free trial for folks interested in that deeper level of insight. Next slide, please. Just super quick history on me. I'm one of the co-founders of Spend Matters. I won't go into the gory details there, but I've spent way too much time over the years researching supplier management technology relative to other areas of procurement. And the reason is I'm keenly interested in the topic. I think we called the supplier management trend and boom before it happened, and I think we were probably a little bit exuberant or overly aggressive in when we thought this would really take off. But the good news for prognosticators like us is it finally happened, even though we thought a lot would happen in 2011, 2012 around supply risk. This year we're seeing much greater adoption and uptake of supplier management tools. Some people don't call them that. They call them governance, risk, and compliance tools. But the idea is managing your suppliers and your partners more effectively around risk, around onboarding, around enablement, around a whole bunch of areas. And as I mentioned, this is really Peter's talk today. I'm just going to give a few quick thoughts in a minute. And I am extremely respectful of his seniority and knowledge here. He's looked at this sector much longer than I have, and he's definitely the one to pay attention to today. Next slide, please. So why does supplier management matter? We're extremely keen on looking at this more broadly outside of just manufacturing, but I want to talk about manufacturing for a minute in the world economy because I think it highlights how important supplier management is from our focus today, shifting away from sourcing and other types of supplier engagement. Peter's going to touch more broadly on supplier management across other categories of spend as well. But if we look at what's going on in the global economy today, whether it's folks like Apple shifting spend back to North America, shifting contract manufacturers, if we look at the challenges of managing how our suppliers behave in certain parts of the world, Bangladesh most recently with the factory tragedies. And if we look at all the regulations coming down the pike right now, both in the U.S. and globally, around environmental health and safety concerns, whether it's REACH, whether it's RoHS, whether it's conflict minerals. We've got to begin to look at our activities from a supplier-facing standpoint and drill down not just to the vendor level and our vendor master, but down to the product level and even the substance level. So how do we show traceability? It's our belief here, and this is critical. There are a lot of folks in procurement who we talk to who are very down on the fact of conflict minerals compliance. Oh, this is just something else I have to do. You know, I can't believe this has been tossed on my plate. And we hear that on the supplier side as well, especially suppliers who don't have the resources to manage it. But the key here is that whether it's conflict minerals or something else, you're going to need to do this in the future. There's going to be additional regulations. There's going to be additional customer requirements around providing traceability down not just to the supplier level, but onto the substance material part, component, bill of material levels as well. So think about globally, not just in the U.S. and Europe, but think about globally on those regulations, and there's many coming down the pike to look at. We've also got to think about those risk elements and how they can impact the bottom line. You know, negative press is one thing, but negative press that impacts sales, it impacts, you know, commercial deals, impacts our ability to sell into markets. And let's think, too, about, you know, the benefits of top-line potential. If we can mark greenness as part of our initiatives in terms of being conflict-free, not just to the letter of the law in the U.S., but on a global basis, that can help our top line. Next slide, please. So what's possible today? Just some very quick case studies to bring this alive. You know, in one case, we've observed and documented a high-tech manufacturer was able to bring a product to market on time in the EU despite new types of regulations. In this case, it was lead-free and REACH compliant together. But the ability not just to, you know, hit a deadline and provide that traceability, but actually bring it to market more quickly. So this is a top-line issue versus just a bottom line around simple compliance. Another example is a financial services company, so different industry, being able to show that any vendor who walked on site had the requisite and current insurance documentation for compliance purposes. You might think it's simple to track insurance certifications, but it's not, especially if you've got lots of vendors and subs coming on site, and you've got to track this documentation. Another one I'm more excited about, just because I think the healthcare industry is so ripe for overhaul right now around technology use, is being able to ensure that not just vendors are compliant, but their employees are compliant. So literally being able to track contractors and employees of suppliers who step foot on hospitals and integrated delivery network facilities, so large hospitals in the U.S., making sure they've got their vaccinations, so that literally any contractor or supplier or sub who comes on, they can't get a badge to get in the door anywhere in the hospital facility unless they personally have had their vaccinations. And that rolls up to the overall vendor profile and supplier master data. Fascinating case study, but very effective. And then we're aware of a number of companies doing some pretty creative things right now around conflict minerals compliance on the multi-tier level in the supply chain. There are some very interesting archetypes around supplier diversity and multi-tier supplier management, which we think are applicable to conflict minerals. But the challenge with conflict minerals specifically is that you've got to take it down if you truly want to be extremely conservative in how you look at it to the part and component level, so not just the vendor level. But there are different philosophies there, and we're not espousing one over another. We believe you should seek legal and consultative advice based on the SEC guidance. But we do know of some folks taking it down to the part and component level throughout their supply chain. Next slide, please. So what is nirvana here? This graphic on the right, which is hard to read, isn't new. This is something I worked on with somebody years ago, and we still use it today to explain the nirvana of a hub to track not just our information coming out of our systems, whether it's ERPM or fleet, spend analysis, contract management, SPM, but how do we track third-party types of data coming out of, you know, the D&Ds of the world, the EcoVadisas of the world, the 3Es of the world, who provide many different types of data to us. And how do we track that up and down our supply chain as well with Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers? And if we're in the middle of it, say on the Tier 1 level, how does that roll up? So the idea here is being able to look at not just our internal data, enrichment data, but our suppliers' information as well to consider, obviously, items like conflict minerals, safety and quality standards, insurance certs, being able to get into the softer side of things around labor practices as well, and potentially not just individual but shared factory audits and other types of auditing responsibilities, and to have the central hub, the central clearinghouse to manage this information for us. It's our hypothesis today that we're doing far too many things on a one-to-one basis around supplier management, when if we look at how we could potentially serve as a hub for our suppliers, or even in the future, look more toward the network approach to manage this data incorporated into our supplier management systems, we'll all save a lot of time and have more accurate data. Next slide, please, which I believe is a poll question.
So we're going to go ahead and move into our first poll here. So besides cost visibility, where would you get the most value from multi-tier supplier visibility? Is it in the supply visibility itself, orders, inventory, capacity? Is it in regulatory compliance status, supplier diversity, other supply risk information like financial or geographic, or supplier performance? I'll give you about 10 more seconds here and we'll show the results. All right, here's your results.
So interesting here. So supply visibility came first around orders, inventory, capacity. Supplier performance came in second, 28%. Then other types of information, so the catch-all 21, compliance 12, and diversity 7. I would still caution folks around diversity, though. There's some great examples, probably even within your companies, you can look at, done by supplier diversity teams around multi-tier supplier management. Now we've got to roll up those efforts more broadly, but they're good use cases. So with that, I'm going to toss it back to the team. Sheena, I'll toss it back to you, and I believe Peter is up next.
Welcome, Peter.
Hi. Well, good afternoon from Europe rather than good morning, or almost evening, perhaps if you're in continental Europe. Almost time for the gin and tonic, I think, but maybe not quite. So, yeah, I'm celebrating my 30 years in procurement any minute now, which is quite a scary thought. So, brief introduction. I started in food manufacturing with the Mars Group as I got into purchasing for the first time. Had the great pleasure of running a potato factory briefly, and then was procurement director for 3 very different large organizations for 10 years or so. Had the honor of serving the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. I was their president, and I've been mainly consulting, speaking, writing, thinking about procurement, I suppose, for the last 10 years or so. I co-authored a book a couple of years ago on buying professional services. And when I'm not thinking about procurement, I grow vegetables, follow sport, and collect, and sometimes even drink wine. So next slide. I think Jason probably covered this. We started the UK-Europe operation 3 years ago. Jason's told you about the rest of the family. I think in total, certainly, we're read by more people a month than any other procurement publication. And the tone we aim for, as regular readers will know, is insightful but sometimes irreverent. And although we're sponsored by software firms and consultants and so on, we're editorially independent. So that was one of the first things I learned from Jason, the importance of writing independently for our readers. And I think at times that's probably cost us business. I know it certainly cost Jason some business a while ago at a very major procurement software firm because he wouldn't write nice things about them. But that's, I think that's what makes us worth reading. So that's probably enough of the commercial. Next slide, please. So on to the topic of the day. I suspect that those of you in Europe will sort of get this slide, may need a bit of explanation in other parts of the world. We've had an interesting example of supply management, or perhaps unsuccessful supply management in Europe in the last few months, where horse meat has been found in quite a number of manufactured food products. Now, of course, this is seen as a positive in France, but perhaps less so in the UK and some other countries. And what became clear was a lot of the companies who were manufacturing food products really didn't have much of a grip on their supply base, their supply chain, and actually what their suppliers were up to. And some of the supply chains were quite extraordinary. We found horse meat that was entering the supply chain in abattoirs in Romania and Eastern Europe was being shipped off to Luxembourg or France, sold on by traders to factories in Ireland, then coming back into the UK, into our supermarkets and stores. And I suspect certainly the end consumer and even a lot of the manufacturers had no idea that this was the supply chain history of this material. So that's just a sign of how important supply management can be. It's had a material effect. There was the biggest UK supermarket declared results today, and they weren't very good. I know that as a shareholder. And they actually mentioned horse meat scandal as having a measurable effect on their business. So, next slide. So suppliers are critical to virtually all organisations. And of course there is a positive side to it. This picture, if you don't recognise it, is the London 2012 Olympic Park, pretty much in finished form. And I was fortunate really. In about 2008 or 9, I was asked to do a piece of work by part of the UK government to look at how the construction programme was going and make some recommendations on whether contract and supplier management needed to be improved. You know, was it all going well? And it was a really interesting experience. The park was half built then, and I got to go around it and talk to people. And actually it was one of those consulting assignments that proved quite difficult because, of course, to justify your fee, you have to come up with some recommendations and you know, find some problems. And I really struggled because actually the contract and supplier management that was going on around that huge construction program was the best I'd probably ever seen, at both a detailed level, a more relationship level, sustainability, all that sort of stuff. And the end result was, I mean, an expensive program, but one that actually came in under budget, ahead of schedule, beat all the targets for safety and sustainability. And that was delivered by suppliers, by a whole range of suppliers. Next slide, please. One of my main interests, I suppose, is procurement of professional services, and that's what my book was about. And this is a slightly mischievous slide, looking at another organisation I know well. The Royal Bank of Scotland, of course, bought NatWest, which was my last procurement director role, and expanded greatly, and then went horribly wrong in 2007, and destroyed 95% of shareholder value very quickly. I speak again as a shareholder of that company. And it just struck me that no doubt when RBS were talking about acquiring ABN AMRO, no doubt they had lots of expensive consulting firms, legal firms, investment bankers, advisors of all sorts, suppliers, who are offering them advice on their strategy and on that acquisition. And I wonder whether any of them said, don't do it. It's going to be a disaster. Because the thing about suppliers in a lot of categories, professional services is a great example, is that they can create or destroy a whole lot more value for the buying firm than the actual value of the contract. So, you know, if RBS had paid £100,000 to a really, really smart consultant who'd put the convincing case to them not to buy ABN AMRO, that could have saved billions of pounds of shareholder value. So suppliers of all goods and services can have a huge positive effect or a huge negative effect on the business. And that's a sort of obvious statement, but I think, as we'll come on to, I think we sort of forget that sometimes. Next slide. And of course when suppliers fail or suppliers don't perform, often that is our fault. I mean, our, as the buyers, as the procurement people. We chose the wrong supplier. We didn't get to know them well enough. We didn't get the right information about them. And then perhaps after we chose them, we didn't put the right contract in place to incentivize them properly, to align our objectives and goals. We didn't manage them properly. We didn't build a relationship. We didn't incentivize them, motivate them, all that sort of thing. So a lot of it comes down to our performance in managing the supplier and the contract. Okay, next slide. So I've been thinking about this quite a bit over the last year or so. and as Jason says, I'm not a technologist, I'm a practitioner, so I sort of think about it from that point of view. And it struck me that maybe one of the reasons why I think most of us believe supplier contract management hasn't been as good as it might be in most organisations is the way we as the procurement profession tend to think about what we do. And we tend to look, we were taught at procurement school, as it were, probably at two process cycles when we describe what we do in procurement. And I've used these charts many times in presentations and sessions. So next slide. And they tend to be the strategic sourcing, you can have other names for it, category management, whatever, process cycle and transactional. So without going into every bit of detail, strategic sourcing, we tend to start with looking at the market, suppliers, researching that. We align that with what we need internally, with requirements, specifications. We turn that into some sort of contracting plan or category plan. We go through a supplier selection process, which may be very formal, maybe RFX, maybe just talking to a few people, whatever. We get into negotiation, contracting, and then we manage the process. Manage the delivery. And that's the strategic sourcing cycle. The transactional cycle is the not so sexy part of it. Planning, requisition, order, etc. Purchase to pay, transactional, administrative, whatever you want to call it. So these two cycles describe pretty well what a lot of us see as the procurement task. But when you think about it, there's a bit of a missing link there, which is actually the supplier hardly features. The word supplier is on that chart once. Next slide, Sheena. So what about the supplier? Because we've said already, the supplier is absolutely central to the success of our organisations. And therefore, it must be essential to the success of us as procurement people, as procurement functions and organisations. And yet we've been perhaps sort of downplaying the supplier in favour of other ways of looking at what we do day to day. So I was thinking about the way procurement focus has changed over the years. Next slide. And I think if we go way back in history, I'm not going to dig into this too far, but back to the pyramids probably. The first task of procurement, purchasing, buying, was really about keeping things going, keeping the supply of materials to the British Navy in the 16th century, or to the guy or girl in charge of building the pyramids. As we got into the 20th century, we got more interested in the whole idea of administration. I think the concept of bureaucracy was invented in the 1920s, so the whole recording and accounting for what we're buying grew from then and has continued to be important. And the legal contract also became more important. Rather than a handshake or a verbal contract, things actually getting set down more formally. Then when I got into procurement, early 80s, was just the time that ERP systems were appearing. And very much the next 10 years and more saw the growth of computerization. We suddenly got these lovely machines on our desks that could do clever things. And we got really into procurement process. And e-procurement. We got so excited about e-procurement, which really was looking at just the transactional side of things. And then around 20 years ago, I remember the first academic paper I read even. I think it's Smith, Klein, Beecham and McKinsey's or Carney's, I can't remember. This idea of category management coming into procurement. And that was perhaps the first time we'd had a real scientific method, as it were, to approach what we're doing in procurement. Now, my hypothesis, and really the sort of centre of today, is that maybe we're seeing another change now. And maybe not category management is dead or anything as dramatic as that, but we're moving to a time when the supplier and supplier management will take centre stage. Next slide. Why do I think that is happening and will happen? Well, I think procurement is focusing more, quite rightly, on total value now rather than price or cost, and we're hopefully becoming better aligned to the needs of our stakeholders and wider business needs, stakeholders, users, budget holders, different parts of the business. And if you look at value and if you look at alignment, that takes you naturally into thinking about suppliers, not categories, not process. You talk to the CIO, the head of marketing, the production manager, they won't relate to categories. They will relate very much to suppliers. They will see their key suppliers as being essential to them achieving their own objectives and delivering what they have to deliver. Absolutely central to their success. And I think actually procurement, we have to talk more their language. And some of the language we've used may be getting overly obsessed with process, with categories, hasn't endeared us to our colleagues always. Jason touched, or more than touched, on risk. That's another factor I think undoubtedly is taking us towards more focus and a clearer view on suppliers. Again, there are risk elements that apply at category level. I wouldn't deny that for a moment, but I'd argue there's a lot more that need to be looked at actually a supplier level. And then I think finally, technology is helping. I mean, the prospect when I started in procurement, you know, if you'd said, can you give me details about the top 500 suppliers to Mars? Well, frankly, the answer is almost certainly no. But if I could have got it, it would have required an awful lot of digging through an awful lot of pieces of paper. And technology now is allowing us to get better insights into suppliers, more information, to communicate more easily. We're seeing social media type platforms coming into procurement, and it's all just allowing us to get closer and more focused on suppliers. Next slide. So we're beginning to see people looking at perhaps an alternative to those two process charts that I put up earlier. So an alternative approach might be the supplier management process, or supplier lifecycle management, some people are calling it. It's linked to supplier information management, but in my head it's something broader, and you know, it's not purely supplier information management. And that starts really at the beginning when we're looking at suppliers, we're looking at markets, identifying who are the people we want to work with, looking at things like qualification processes, evaluating suppliers, doing that due diligence Jason talked about, and that takes us, of course, into all sorts of interesting corporate social responsibility areas and so on. It's risk management. I've got that at a relatively early stage of the cycle, but really, I'd argue risk management overlays the entire supply management cycle. It's a key part of the whole thing. We then get into the selection contracting process. I mean, that's there in the strategic sourcing cycle as well, of course, and it's an absolutely central part of what we do in procurement. But again, it's supplier focused, should be supplier focused. Onboarding, actually getting the information from the suppliers we want to work with so that we do know who we're dealing with and we do know enough about them. There's an interesting question actually, probably not to get into today, which is when is it best to collect that onboarding information about suppliers, at what stage in the cycle? So we might touch on that in the questions. And then once the supplier is up and running with us, how do we manage their performance? How do we get the most out of them? Both at a day-to-day delivery level and also in those more developmental relationship areas. Spend analysis, knowing what we're spending with who, feeding that back into a rationalization process. Not enough organizations think about this. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about new suppliers and bringing people in. But how do you actually weed out suppliers when it's appropriate? So this is perhaps a slightly different way of looking at procurement life. And as I say, I'm not arguing for a moment that category management or strategic sourcing is dead, but I think this gives us a different view of what we do and will align us, as I say, better with many of our business colleagues. Next slide. This is really saying some of the things I've said on the last slide, but this is answering the question, well, what do you mean by supplier management? And I think it includes all of these things, and probably more we haven't thought of there. So all the way from initial identification and engagement, the classification, verification, etc. As I said before, risk needs to go through the whole cycle. It's not a one-off event. through the sourcing process, onboarding, contract management, performance management, and so on, all the way through that process. So, coming back to the hypothesis, the supplier needs to sit at the heart of what we're doing and thinking, our strategies, our way of working in procurement. I think that will enable us to get more out of suppliers, enable us to deliver value, innovation, better results to our organisations. It will also align us better, I think, with the colleagues we work with, who frankly don't see things through the category prism as much as they see them through the supplier prism. We can't in an hour give all the answers and solutions to, well, you know, what do I actually have to do to implement this? But as we said earlier, I've written a paper on this topic, and I think everyone who's registered for today should get a copy in the next few days. That goes into more detail on a lot of these topics. Very happy to have feedback on that. I'll do a bit of blogging on the site around the paper and the event today, and I'd love you to contribute to that. Actually, next slide. It's one of the things I'm very sort of pleased and proud about on our site, that we get so many comments. Often rude comments, I have to say, but well, no, not too rude. But we have a great array of both regular commentators and occasional people, and often, this is not false modesty, often the comments are much more illuminating and interesting than the stuff I write. So I'll be blogging about this topic as well. Do read the paper, do chip in, let us know what you think. Thanks for listening. I'm hanging around for questions. But I'll hand over now to Richard Waugh, who's the Vice President Corporate Development for Zycus. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Peter. Some very compelling arguments there as to why procurement should begin, or perhaps has already begun, this shift from a category focus to a more supplier-centric view of the supply management world. So for my part in today's presentation, I'd like to examine some benchmark data from a few different sources to get a sense of where we are in that transition, and use the poll questions to gather some real-time benchmarks from our audience along the way. Then I'll finish up by looking at some best practice techniques and tools that are being used by the top performing organizations, which are in fact putting the supplier at the heart of procurement, and they're not doing that out of the goodness of their own hearts, by the way, but because they're able to realize some pretty significant benefits along the way. So the next slide, we'll start with a process view, and the SRM, or supplier relationship management process diagram here is, actually I think pretty similar to the one that Peter showed, but it really mirrors, I've overlaid on top of that the sell side of the equation, the customer relationship management process, and when you look at those side by side, you do kind of see a mirror image, that each one starts with either a market or a category strategy, and then includes a way to find and qualify prospective clients or suppliers, and entails a rigorous methodology for moving those prospects through either their sales or sourcing pipelines, respectively. And of course, the outcome is a negotiation and award, followed by onboarding those new partners and ongoing account management and support. So they're really very similar when you compare the two. But I think if we look at where SRM, if you will, is in its evolution versus customer relationship management, or CRM, the supplier relationship management processes tend to be less formal, and to date have been allocated fewer tools and resources, despite what one could argue is greater complexity on the supply management side. So for instance, whereas sales typically involve a geographic focus, a commodity or a category manager is likely to have a global supply base to manage, so more complexity there. Looking at, in terms of the dollars being managed, and looking at the Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies, or CAPS, industry benchmark report from the manufacturing industry, it shows that per supply management full-time equivalent, each one is managing over $17 million in spend. So that would be a really big quota on the sales side. Likewise, in terms of the span of the number of accounts being managed, 122 active suppliers per FTE in the supply management space for the manufacturing industry. So that would be also a very large territory if you were to compare it to the sell side. So there's an argument that says the complexity, the potential value to the customer really warrants more focused on supply management as a process and discipline, and more of an allocation of resources and tools. Next. So digging a little bit deeper then into this industry vertical benchmark, you can look at the manufacturing industry. First of all, they've got pretty good handle on their overall spending, with about 88% of total spend under management. Most of that, of course, goes to direct materials. But the pie chart on the right really looks at, within the manufacturing industry, how are they allocating their resources? And I think it's indicative of the mindset that Peter was talking about towards category management, that focus remains ingrained in organizations. So if you look, for instance, the combination of category and materials management and logistics, which is also a category or product focus, over half the total resources are allocated towards categories. And if you also include indirect spend, that would be more than 2/3 of the total. Now, on its own, category management is nearly double that of the resources allocated to supplier management, so 31% to 16%. So the shift is happening, but certainly there's more that needs to happen to rebalance or reallocate assets from a category management focus to a supply management focus or supplier management focus. So next we'd like to do a poll question to find out amongst the audience, what does this resource allocation mix look like currently? So for your organization, what is the ratio of category management to supplier management resources currently? So is it more than 2 to 1, or somewhere between 1 to 2 to 1, roughly even 1 to 1, or less than 1 to 1?
So we'll get about 10 seconds left here, and then I'll show the results. All right, here we go.
Okay. So it's more than 2 to 1. Kind of a resounding answer there. The rest trail by a wide margin. So I think that really supports, it mirrors the manufacturing industry benchmarks from CAPS, and really supports the idea that category management has been well established as a discipline, and the resource allocation reflects that. And we're maybe on the cusp or on the verge of a shift to more focus on supplier management. So looking at a few more data points here, now in terms of how are organizations, specifically again in the manufacturing vertical, measuring supplier performance. So although they have fewer resources allocated to supplier management than category management, manufacturers in the CAPS benchmark study are measuring 100% of those that participated are going through a rigorous process of measuring supplier performance across a number of metrics. And those that are used most frequently, on-time delivery, total cost of ownership, quality, parts per million, for example, were used by every manufacturer. Those essentially correspond to the bar chart on the right that ranks the importance of each on a scale of 1 to 5. So you see a variety of key metrics being used here fairly rigorously, fairly frequently by all that participate. And they look at things like not just cost, but quality, innovation, risk mitigation, and the sub-tier or multi-tier supplier management that Jason referred to earlier as well. And then the last piece of data on this one, is the frequency with which they're rating the supplier performance. So more than a third are monitoring and reporting supplier performance at least quarterly. although this remains an annual or less frequent exercise for many. And that may be because it's such a laborious exercise to gather the information, and as new technologies are deployed and implemented to make that process much more automated, that it becomes possible to rate supplier performance more frequently. And that is the topic of the next poll question. I'd like to know, for your organization, what is the frequency of supplier performance measurement, commonly referred to as scorecarding, for your key suppliers? So this is not for the entire supply base, but with key suppliers, is it less frequently than annually? Is it done on an annual basis? Is it quarterly, monthly, or more frequently than monthly?
I'm just getting some answers in. And here you go.
Okay, so the leading response was annually, and followed closely by quarterly. So similar, again, to the benchmark data that we showed earlier. Small percentage, I guess 11% monthly or more frequently than monthly. And some just find it, again, probably too laborious to gather all that data, and therefore are doing it less frequently than annually. Okay. Now I'd like to look at a few different best practices. And one, of course, in the whole supplier management space is first starting with a segmentation. So of the thousands of suppliers that an organization engages with, being able to stratify that supply base and put them in buckets. And when you do that, as this analysis from the Hackett Group shows, it's a relatively small percentage of suppliers, in this case less than 11%, that constitute the majority, 80%, of the total spend. And here it's important to further segment those supplier categories into strategic, critical, and important suppliers, and devise and implement appropriate strategies for each, while focusing much less attention on those tactical suppliers, often 90% or more of the total, that comprises the tail spend of about 20% of total spending. So interesting that the top performers in the Hackett Group benchmarks actually focus more resources on fewer strategic suppliers and generate much higher returns as a result. So just to share some data with you, for example, they allocate 1 FTE in supplier management per 8 strategic suppliers. And as you see from this analysis, per $1 billion of spend, there may be as many as 18 strategic suppliers per billion. Now, compare that to their peer group, where 1 supply management FTE manages 47 strategic suppliers. So the peer group is managing 6 times more suppliers, but the ROI for the top performers is almost 10 times higher per strategic supplier. So the measurement comes out at 1.1 million savings generated per strategic supplier for the top performers, as compared to only about 120,000 for the per supplier in the peer group. So another poll question. For your organization, looking at that supplier segmentation, what would you say is the percentage of suppliers that account for 80% of your organization's spend? So is it less than 5%, so very rationalized small group, 5 to 10%, 10 to 20%, more than 20%, or frankly, I have no idea?
So we'll give about 5 more seconds here. And here you go.
Okay. So this one's a lot more mixed, although the I have no idea response is as high as any on the list at 26%, and this is a challenge because it kind of starts with reliable and accurate spend data, which is difficult to gain that visibility for many. But you can also see that there's a healthy percentage that have concentrated that and focused on strategic suppliers where less than 20% is probably 2/3 of the total here overall. So that's interesting that many have focused in on reining in and controlling spending with a smaller group of strategic suppliers that leads to then a focused effort in the area. Okay, next. So in terms of the business case justification then for this, a comparison of the business case for the top performers versus the peer group shows almost 2 times greater overall returns from supplier management for the top performers. And these are savings above and beyond those generated from sourcing and negotiations. And that makes supplier management a very important focus area, especially for mature sourcing organizations that may feel as though they've wrung as much savings out of sourcing as possible. So the supplier management, the 2 times returns for the top performers versus the peer group has the same proportionality whether we're talking about cost savings or reductions that are generated from closer supplier collaboration or top-line growth that's attributed to supplier innovation. Now, ironically, the top performers are also much less likely to need a business case to justify their investment in supplier management and are much more likely, almost 2 to 1, to say that no hard benefits at all are needed, that the supplier management investment decision is treated as a strategic initiative. And they're also far less likely than the 60% of the peer group that relies on external benchmarks or case studies to bolster their own business case. So next. Yeah, so one other data point here. This is a set of key performance indicators from the Aberdeen group that again show a wide disparity between the top performers or best in class and the rest of the overall industry average or laggards that they're compared against. So they have a much lower incidence of both duplicated suppliers and supplier failures and a much higher rate of suppliers actually delivering on time. So not surprisingly, these best-in-class companies have also been much more active in deploying a variety of technologies and techniques for supplier management, starting with things like spend analysis, vendor management, performance monitoring, onboarding, and the rest. So on the next slide, what I'd like to leave you with then are some best practices from a technology enablement standpoint. And effective supplier management technologies, such as shown here, that Zycus provides, tend to address both supplier information and supplier performance management, respectively, and they include these capabilities. So starting with supplier information management, a centralized repository for creating and managing supplier data with a portal that provides self-service access for suppliers to enter and maintain their profiles, but with a screening tool and a workflow capability for the buy side of the equation to vet that information, onboard the suppliers, ensure that the documentation, things like insurance certificates that were discussed earlier, are current and up to date. And that in the onboarding process, you're preventing the onboarding of duplicates or blacklisted suppliers, for example, that shouldn't be part of your equation. And then the supplier performance management capabilities as well, leveraging templates or prior KPIs and surveys to quickly create scorecards that provide holistic views of supplier performance, both quantitative and qualitative inputs that integrate with ERP and other source systems to automatically pull that performance data and enable a very rapid, through drag and drop, stakeholder survey creations, and being able to look at and roll up supplier performance from very granular views down to the part, the plant, location, or business unit, as well as overall aggregate supplier performance. And based on performance that falls below targeted levels, being able to implement corrective action plans to address that performance to bring it up to the desired type of delivery. So last, on the next slide. Talked a lot about benchmarking and best practices sharing in my portion of today's webinar. I just wanted to make you aware of an upcoming Horizon meeting, which is an opportunity for procurement leaders to participate in intensive benchmarking and best practices sharing across their peer group, engage industry analysts and thought leaders, including Spend Matters, our partners in today's webinar. So please make plans to join us in San Antonio, Texas for Horizon, October 27th through the 29th. Thanks very much for participating in today's webinar. Look forward to answering any questions you may have.
All right, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jason. Jason actually had to drop off and hop on a flight, so Richard and Peter will be taking audience questions at this point. If you have one, go ahead and enter it in the questions pane over in your control panel over there. And let's start out with a question. I think either of you could take this. Someone from the audience asked, should onboarding be one of the first priorities as an assessment?
First priorities as a?
Of an assessment.
Of an assessment. I think there's some interesting questions about when you onboard, which I guess links to the priority, and I'll let Richard give his view as well. I guess I sort of thought that the main part of onboarding came when I'd actually selected a supplier and I knew I was going to do business with them. But I've talked to a few people recently who make the argument, which I quite like, that when a supplier wants to do work with you before they've actually been selected, but when they're putting themselves forward as part of a competitive process or as part of a preferred supplier list or something, or just coming onto your radar, that's actually the time to gather information about them because they want to be helpful, they want to give you the information, and of course you'll want to know that that information about them in order to make your selection decision. So yeah, I'm coming around to the view that you onboard with a certain amount of information right at the beginning of your relationship with the supplier, and then if you decide you do want to do business with them, you go deeper in effect and probably gather a second level of data. But I think it's a high priority because all the way through the rest of the process in terms of performance management, relationship management, risk management, all of that sits on not very good foundations if you haven't gathered the right basic information to begin with. So, Richard?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Peter, certainly from the technology platform standpoint, we do see assessment right at the outset of that onboarding stage, and because of the volume of data that the buying organization has to deal with, suppliers are providing, again to your point, Peter, that they may be new suppliers that want to be exposed to you, do business with you, but the volume of data demands that the buyers have more tools to help do a rapid assessment based on that supplier's profile. So for instance, being able to set sort of a screen and weight and score the supplier inputs to give essentially a preliminary scorecard view right at the onboarding stage is where the assessment starts. So we definitely see that as an assessment, and maybe preliminary assessment to take a look and get a quick read on which suppliers will be the most capable ones according to your own unique requirements.
So one of the next questions that came in is, that's all well and good, but how do you get suppliers to kind of participate in the first place? What if they're not filling in their information correctly or updating it?
Yeah, and that's of course the version of you can lead a horse to water, but how do you make them drink argument. And Peter probably has some good thoughts on this. From a technology standpoint, you try to make it as easy as possible, as intuitive. You provide training and support to walk them through it, but at the end of the day, that participation will be, at least in some measure, reflective of what's the relationship with the buying organization, what's the relative power in the supply chain, and how important is that business to the supplier to comply and come on board?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the advantage of doing it before they've won business with you, is they're generally more enthusiastic then to cooperate. You know, if they're embedded and they think their position is pretty secure, it's easier for them to say, well, we're not going to bother. And it's a bit like running a no purchase order, no payment policy on the transactional side. You know, that'll only work if you can get your organization to implement it. But if the supplier finally knows that they won't get paid if there's no purchase order, or they won't get paid if they haven't submitted the supplier information, then my experience is, as long as you can hold that line for just a few months, actually, they'll come around to it. And I know organizations that have done that. I think the other point which Richard makes, which is spot on, is making it easy for them. And I mean, I'm a supplier as well with my Spend Matters, and I still do a bit of consulting. But I had a great example recently, because my daughter's entered the world of work and is actually pursuing a sort of self-employed career, and she had to submit her first invoice for £50 to a particular customer who use a large shared services centre, and she was sent the form to fill in to register as a supplier, along with a 15-page PowerPoint presentation telling her how to fill in the form. And to be fair to the people in the shared service centre, they'd gone to a lot of trouble with this PowerPoint presentation to really explain how she had to fill in the supplier registration form. But you sort of think it shouldn't need 15 pages of PowerPoint. It should be a little bit more obvious how to do it. So I think that's an important point.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions, so keep them coming, audience. Here's someone going back to kind of your presentation, Peter, and I know you touched on this a bit, but are you saying that category management isn't important anymore?
No, not at all. I mean, if you're in charge of buying, I don't know, desktop IT or marketing services or packaging for a major organization, then clearly you need to look across that category, that item that you're buying. You need to look at the market, you need to make assessments, you need to have plans that are all based on how you're going to manage that category. However, I don't think that means you shouldn't look hard at the suppliers as well. I think we got so caught up in category management, it was almost like the supplier was just, oh yeah, I did this great category strategy and plan, and I went through the process, I leveraged my spend, and I ended up with a few suppliers, and now that's it, I've done it. So I guess what I'm looking at is something that says, of course you need category plans, you need to look at things that way, but don't forget that it's actually suppliers at the end of the day who deliver the packaging or provide the marketing services that your internal stakeholders care about, and they are the end result of our category work and our procurement work. So it's, I guess I'm looking, I'm not, make quite a nice headline to say, category management is dead, but I'm not saying that. It's a rebalancing, though, to say the supplier needs more focus and put the category in the right place as an important way of looking at what we do, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, and for my part, I think it comes back to some extent to that business case justification that, category management delivers a certain benefit in terms of negotiated cost savings through that sourcing methodology. But many organizations are finding that difficult to repeat. And therefore, we'll take a look at that. The data that I shared suggests 3.4% of total spend, that's a benefit that's out there that's incremental to what can be gained through that category management or sourcing focus that has nothing to do with negotiated cost savings. It's improvements in the supply chain efficiencies and benefits that get shared between the trading partners, and it's top-line growth through innovation, through the closer collaboration that this type of discipline enables.
Thank you. So with that, we're going to wrap for today. If we did not get to your question, we will check out spendmatters.co.uk and spendmatters.com. I'd like to thank Jason Busch, Peter Smith, and Richard Waugh for joining us today. And please, again, make sure to help us improve our programming by taking that survey that pops up right after the webinar ends. And keep an eye out for the white paper version of Putting the Supplier at the Heart of the Procurement in the next few days. Thanks for joining us today.